Well, this weekend's protests in Charlottesville, Virginia brought hundreds of neo-Nazis, white nationalists, and white supremacists all together for a violent protest that even resulted in the killing death of a young woman. Racism continues to be an issue in this country, along with white supremacy. Here now to share more about America's racial history and the current state of white supremacy in America, please welcome the Chairperson of African American Studies at Lehman College, Dr. Mark Christian. He's also the Department Chair, and good to have you.
Thank you, Daren. Thanks for having me.
Important conversation to have. When we look at what's happening in Charlottesville, Virginia, many people go back to the 60s and say this is nothing but a rewind of the 60s. Some people thought white supremacy was gone. Some people feel that it's been just simply buried and put away. Give us an assessment.
Well, first of all, we have to go to the beginning of this nation, which is 1776. It's very young, this nation, 241 years. But at the start of the nation, it began as a half-free, half-enslaved nation built on genocide of the American Indian. So we have to be conscious of the origins of the United States as a nation. Secondly, because of time, we have to jump to 1865 and the end of enslavement, because it's at that point when the origins of the KKK become apparent in the United States under a Confederate general called Nathan B. Forrest. So around 1865 to 1866, the development of the KKK took place in the United States and intimidated African Americans across the southern states, where Reconstruction was taking place. Reconstruction lasted for about 12 years, where African Americans received a modicum of social uplift and had political empowerment. But 12 years was a very short time. After post-Reconstruction, 1877 up to the 1920s, you had what's called as the nadir experience of African Americans, which was the lowest point, with the intimidation, lynching. Any African American attempting to vote would be sometimes killed or lynched. So that is the history and the intimidation of the KKK. That's its origins. If we jump forward to the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights was about bringing down the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896, which was in that nadir period. And Dr. King and many other of the civil rights leaders were about bringing an end to formal segregation in the southern states. The KKK re-emerged, intimidating the civil rights movement. Fast forward to 2017, we have the KKK rising again, because the political office, the highest office in the land, has a de facto supporter of far right-wing politics.
So let me ask the question, how far, because some people thought the KKK was pretty much a dead thing and just pretty minimal, but from what we're seeing and what's being present right now, what we saw in Virginia, there's a lot of life out there.
There's a lot of life, and they've always been there. And for those viewers who want to know more, they should study the Southern Poverty Law Center, because they've kept a track of hate groups in the United States for at least 40 years. So they have a very good track on hate groups in America. So your point is, they went under a rock, but they've always been active, yeah? With the advent of the 45th president, we see the right wing coming out in droves.
We used to see, we saw with the KKK sheets covering heads. Now
Yes.
there's no the sheets covering heads. People are very vocal. People are very outspoken. As I said in the last segment, the person that drove into the car, their car had their license plate in clear display. So clearly, no hiding. Why?
They're confident. They're a very confident group, because the president is a de facto supporter. So they're coming out emboldened, strengthened by Trump's rhetoric. Not only Trump, we've got to be very specific about who's behind Trump, because you've got Bannon, Stephen Miller, and Sebastian Gorka There are extremely far-right thinkers within the White House think tank. So it's not as if it's just Trump, but Trump is a big reason why right-wing groups are coming to the fore, in my opinion.
Right. And so when we look at the president, we see right now a cabinet that lacks diversity. You see a lot of things in the White House that lacks diversity.
Yeah.
You've got those minority groups who literally say it is the, quote, White House.
It is the White House, or the White House.
How do we address this as a nation now? Because obviously we see protests coming against us. We know how things were handled in the 60s. What do we do now?
The point I want to get across, or one of my key points, is not to have divisiveness. There are young white people now, young white people who are being influenced by this political era. I want them to understand that back in the 60s, you had Viola Liuzzo, who was murdered in 1965. She was a white woman from Detroit. She got lost in civil rights history. You had Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman. They're more well-known, the civil rights young students working in the 60s who were murdered for fighting for freedom of African Americans and other people of color. This weekend, the weekend just passed, we had Heather Heyer being murdered. Now, this is a clear indication that whites have always been involved in the struggle for African American freedom. And we need to keep an emphasis of that in order to keep the community together. We have a very good leader in the governor in New York. We have a very good mayor who are for civil rights and human rights. The key for us as educators, as commentators, is to make sure we keep the community, the good side of the community, together through this bumpy road, because it's going to be a bumpy road.
So how are we doing that?
Well, we've got to educate. We've got to get out there. I mean, I'm not particularly used to TV interviews, right. So I'm stepping out. This is an example of me stepping out.
But you got a classroom, is what you said.
But I have a classroom, and I have a very important role as an educator of the civil rights history. I'm a repository of that democratic experience for human and civil rights, and I take it very, very seriously. Dr. King's legacy, Malcolm X, all the leaders, Medgar Evers, who were murdered, Fred Hampton of the Black Panthers was murdered. You know, young people put me in this chair. You know, those civil rights activists put me in this chair as the leader in Africana studies at Lehman College. So I understand my legacy,
right.
And that's why I'm here today.
But
to share also that we are a community. James Reeve was another person, a white man who was murdered in the 60s, 1965, on that Selma to Montgomery experience for voting rights. White man. So young people, I suggest that they study the civil rights movement, study the history of the KKK, and they will be far more informed. And to your question, we've got to get more knowledge out there to the broader community.
Dr. Mark Christian, we got to leave it there. Thank you for coming and sharing with us.
Thank you.
We got to bring you back.
We'll see.
You said you're a repository, so we should come back and bring us some more knowledge.
Okay,
right? Dr.
thank
Mark
you.
Christian. All right, stay tuned. We got more show coming up with us. We'll be right back right after these messages.